Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for another book discussion with Unerased Book Club. We have Fatema, Haque, and Sheela Lal here tonight, the co-facilitators of that group, to discuss with us What Lies Between Us by Nayomi Munaweera. And before we get started, we'll all just go through and give you a quick introduction about who we are. I can start. My name is Lucy, and I am a library tech at the Ann Arbor District Library, and I work, I do story times, youth events, adult events, and I really enjoy doing book discussions. So I'm very happy to be here.
I can go next. My name is Marissa. I am also a library tech. I'm in the outreach department. Basically, we just try to make sure that everyone is being served by the library.
My name is Audrey. I'm a librarian at the Ann Arbor District Library. I work in our collections department and focus on adult events and unusual collections.
I'm Elizabeth. I'm also a library technician, and I work out in the archives, digitizing historical materials and answering reference questions, in addition to just general service across the library.
Last to round out the library crew, my name is Amanda, and I'm also a library technician. I also work alongside Lucy doing a lot of youth programming and story times. I also dabble in a lot of hands-on programs for adults and large events. And I've really enjoyed this past year taking part of so many book discussions, and I'm so glad to be here tonight with everybody again.
Hi, I'm Fatema. I am a Bangladeshi woman, and my background is just a digital background. I'm describing things for folks who are visually impaired, just to get used to describing things. I am a co-facilitator of Unerased Book Club, and I'll let Sheela introduce that. And I am also on the board of Rising Voices, which is an organization that serves Asian American families in the state of Michigan and helps them engage civically across the state.
Thanks, Fatema. Thank you everyone for having us. My name is Sheela. My pronouns are she, her. My background is also a digital background, and it's a photo I took at Adams Peak, which is the tallest point in Sri Lanka. And I'm the founder and co-facilitator of Unerased Book Club, which is a project of Rising Voices. And the Unerased Book Club, for those who are new, is the country's only Asian American book club focusing on Asian American writers from across disciplines and across the large community in diaspora. And the reason I chose this book was because there are so few writers who identify as Sri Lankan or as Elam Tamil who write in English and who really capture like the inherent display of intergenerational trauma. The war in Sri Lanka lasted for 30 years, which arguably touched 3 or 4 generations. And so there's a lot to explore and unpack. So just kind of on that theme, I would love to ask folks, how did you process this book? And if anyone who's going to answer first, could you give a little synopsis of the book?
Well, sure, I'll answer. So this book starts, well, it kind of starts at the end. In a way, it's a confession, or it's a piece of it. So it is about an unnamed woman. We don't learn her name till the end. She is Sri Lankan. She moves to America in her teens. And we learn at the beginning of the book that she has done what she describes as like the worst crime, and she is a mother. And so we can kind of piece together a little bit about what the worst crime for a mother might be. That's where it starts. And then she goes back to her childhood in Sri Lanka, which was sort of idyllic until she started to face some abuse. And then, as you said, Sheela, the war is a background piece of this. So that's like the basic, I would say, plot outlines. And I thought the book was, I mean, there's so many things to say about it, but first of all, like the writing was just so descriptive and visceral, but there's also, the author does such a good job of like including us, but then also there's these secrets throughout the book. So it was a really interesting, I thought, balance between those two things. And I would recommend this book to so many people, but I would also have to say, like, there are some really hard parts to read in this book, but they were just written so well that they were extremely compelling. So, I mean, I loved this book. It might be one of like my favorite books that I've read this year, I think. So that's what I would say about it.
Thank you. Before we dive into it, I just want to give a content warning for our viewers today. This book does deal with some really heavy topics, and so just a little bit of a content warning for sexual violence and trauma, as well as mental health issues, and also there's a murder in there. that there's a lot going on in the book, so just take care of yourself as we talk about these things.
Yeah, thank you for that warning. I thought kind of to Lucy's beautiful synopsis of the book, the fact that it starts at the end and that it's so cyclical, I think is a really interesting theme, both in craft and in the story. And I'm curious if anybody felt a certain way or any way about the cyclical nature of the story.
I really liked it. I loved this book. I thought it fit really well. Of it also heightened some of the drama and the horror of the story. You kind of know what's coming, and you're kind of just figuring out how it happens. And then also, I mean, everything kind of is as cyclical. At the very beginning, she's talking about how we aren't really our own people, that there's so much stuff. You're entering into the story midway. I forget how she phrased it. And kind of placing herself in a larger historical context. And then she's of course talking about her mother. And then so it just it makes a really beautiful pattern.
And I think too, with it starting at the end, you know what, you can guess what's happened. And I had read a review, and so I knew what the act was beforehand. But even though you know what the act is, and you're trying to go through the story and follow this timeline to get to that answer, you almost forget that that's the end, because you're so wrapped up in the beautiful, and the way the author writes is so beautiful. It's so hypnotic and haunting, and it just, her style with so many metaphors and similes, you're just sucked into the language and the dialogue and the prose, and you can visually see where she is and what she's smelling or who she's with and how she's feeling. But you're still going, you're oh wait, this terrible thing happened, how do we get there? You forget for a little bit sometimes when you're wrapped up in some of the words, but it was just really well done. And I love the pacing of it. She's got to go from small girl to adult. And I like the pacing of it. You didn't get every little piece of her life. It would jump 4 years. It's okay, end of high school, or okay, now I'm a nurse. I just thought it worked really well for the author's writing style. And then the story she was trying to tell by starting at the end at the very beginning.
For me, the cyclical nature of it actually worked in multiple ways. One particularly was just because she's talking about intergenerational trauma and just how that cycles through, and trauma itself kind of cycles through. So throughout all the different parts, I noticed that we kept coming back to the trauma, right? The impact of the trauma and revisiting it again and again. And in that way, that too was a cycle that perpetuated and changed a lot of things. And so I thought it was really cool to see that woven through in so many ways and demonstrated in so many ways. So as a reader, it was really fun to kind of piece it together.
Yeah, I would say, just to add to that, the piecing it together, I went back just when I was writing some notes and just immediately got sucked in again. So I started rereading the beginning, and then I was like, oh, that she kind of told, that was hinted at. That was, I mean, and when you're reading it the first time, you don't know what she's actually telling you, but it really was there a lot of the times. And to set that story up in that way is really creative, and I thought well done.
I have a question for other people. To me it was like clear from like page 1 what she had done. Like there was never any like question in my, okay, because we're kind of talking about it like it's a mystery, and I am just curious what like that was like for other people reading, because like from the beginning I was like, this is what she did.
I think even the like opening segment about the moon bear, like that tells it, totally
Yeah.
tells it. And also I feel like that speaks to colonization, like people taking these bears and putting them in cages and forcing them to act this way to produce something for, I mean, it is for traditional medicine, but it just reminded me of a parallel between colonization.
Mm.
I think too, when we talk about figuring out the mystery of the act that happens, I think for me or other readers, it was more like, well, how did she get to that? As you read
Okay.
like, everything that happened in her childhood, seeing how her mother is behaving and the other people in her life and how she behaves in her relationships. I think for me, it was more of the mystery of like, well, how does she get, what is her breaking point? What are all the pieces that we're kind of going up a ladder to figuring out like what brought her to that moment and how was she able to do that and how she felt afterwards. We knew we'd find out, I was hoping we would find out, since it ends at the beginning or beginning and end, whatever, the end is the beginning. We kind of, and I'm glad she spoke about that at the end. But for me, that was the mystery, was just like, oh, well, how did she get there? How did she do it? It was sort of this dark, like, we know it's coming, but how do we get there? And I was really sucked into figuring out or learning more.
A few years ago, I want to say it was like 2015, 2016, there was a case out of Indiana where a woman named Purvi Patel she got rid of her baby. I think she like either gave herself an abortion or she had a newborn and got rid of it. And it was a mental health issue. And the media coverage of it was so flat and critical, as opposed to trying to unpack like why, like kind of in this theme of like what drives a mother to quote a most heinous crime. And I came to this book with that piece of like political conversation in mind, especially because the conversation on reproductive justice is starting to be more expansive in talking about the role of like women from different like cultural backgrounds that aren't American, and what is it for us to support families no matter how they look. But all of that to say, I came to even that first page of like, I am it seems kind of gross, but not in a nasty or in a malevolent way, like looking forward to having a narrative that explores the psyche of somebody who does this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I had looked into more of like the author's life. And I think in an interview, she said like, if I had had natural born children, I don't think I would have been able to write this, which I thought was also really interesting.
I think it's interesting, like in the reference back to the cyclical nature with her mother and the way that her mother is towards her as a kid. And as a kid, she's reflecting about it and like, all I want in the world is for her to love me and like give me all of her attention. And then she gets pregnant and she's like, I don't think I can do this. What if I'm the same person as my mother? And then it ends up happening that way. And she's like reflecting on how trauma is kind of carried in our DNA. And like she was an egg in her mother's body while all this trauma happened. And then same thing happens to her kid. And she's also obviously reflecting on, or not reflecting on, having these like foggy moments where something, she like, it kind of almost comes to the surface what happened to her, but then it shuts down and she can't acknowledge it.
Yeah, kind of along those lines, the book that came to my mind when I read this was Beloved, for obvious reasons. And I was thinking about it in terms of like, as a mother, how, like, I think part of the choice is like, how do you, like, there's like a protective element in the act that's like ending a trauma that your child might experience, that I think is really important to acknowledge, because it's not as if the decision came from nowhere. It's like rooted deeply in the like the like lived experiences of the main character of both books. And I think it's interesting to explore what would drive someone to do that. And I think, yeah, the author did an amazing job. Both of these books, both Beloved and What Lies Between Us, are also incredibly lyrically beautiful books, which is very interesting. But that was, I don't know, what came to my mind.
I have a post-it right on the first page of the story of the moon bear, and I'm like, beloved, because I just that idea that for a mother it would make more sense to end her child's life than to have her child live in the life that's being presented to the child. That was the theme, and then so that was sort of running through my mind as well while I was reading the book.
I think one of the things that struck me the most about this particular book is just how deeply deeply she captures the traumatic brain and how trauma operates. I think that especially everything from having a childhood where the details are fudged and not quite there, or you mix up things and you're not entirely sure, but there's those hints, as we mentioned, right, of what really happened throughout, and how we kind of come to it and piece it together. Or even as an adult, having those flashbacks or moments where you're not quite processing. I think that she captures so much of that, and that's, to me, that's what sells the breaking point, where she does decide to end her child's life in order to, as a protective measure, right? Because she realizes that there's no one trustworthy in this situation. There's no other way to protect a girl child, and that's really terrifying. I mean, I think that it's a natural response to trauma, like the helplessness that comes with the knowing that you couldn't take care of your own. And so in that way, I think she made it very relatable. This character, I think I could imagine myself in those shoes and being like, oh yeah, if I didn't get any help, if I never could shared this burden or this pain with anyone else, then this is a good chance that I might also be in that same mind frame and feel as helpless. And that's terrifying.
It really made me think, because the characters are so quiet. Somebody mentioned secrets. They don't talk. The father is locked away in his study drinking. The mother is locked in the bathroom or in her bedroom. And then the girl is left alone with all of her thoughts. And she can wander the garden with Samson and she explores, but everything is still so quiet. No one speaks of anything and they're so hushed. And I think just having that silence, even as she grows, there's still that quiet. And it made me think of I can be quiet and not talk about things, or it made me think about my adult life, my relationship with various people in various locations. How do it just made me ponder the quietness and how we're closed off or keep things. Also in this book, I really loved the theme of these women. You had the mom and her sister, you had these two cousins. I just loved this femaleness, but it also talked for her a lot about the shame of being a woman, or things you're supposed to do as a woman. And every time she mentioned something, you just stabbed me. I'm like, yep, because it was so spot on. I wrote down a few things. Shame is female. Shame is the price I must pay for this body. Or Samson catches me alone sometimes. Something secret for which only a girl is responsible, for which a girl always has to pay. There's just this guilt. Or even when she makes these quotes about being a mother and what she's supposed to be and what society expects of her and what's on the tabloids. There's so much expectation and thought just around being a woman, whether you're a child or an adult. And that really got me. I really like that a lot about this book.
To your point about the quietness, it's such a theme in Sri Lanka, both in the country and then in the diaspora, in all of the art. So movies, you'll see, Sinhala especially, movies, there's so much quiet. There's so much just existing, but there's very little dialogue, which I found unnerving. Mm-hmm. But even The Funny Boy, which is a book that was adapted into a movie, there's a lot of quiet, and it was made for a Western audience, a lot of quiet there. Michael Ondaatje's books, a lot of quiet. And I, until you said that, like just didn't piece together how much stillness and secrets there are still, and have been and still are, in such a traumatized culture. And I don't know if it, because I've never seen any cinema or any like art before the war, because there was like what, 15 years, not even, between the end of British imperialism and colonization and the start of the conflicts that led to the war. So I don't know what a non-traumatized Sri Lankan piece of culture looks like.
I feel like the moment where the silence could be, or there are a few moments where the silence can be broken, and she resists it. Her mother comes and asks her if anything has been going on, and she says no. And she recognizes, like, this was my moment, but like, you don't know. She doesn't know how her mom's going to respond to that. And so she doesn't take it. And then there's a moment with her cousin when she's having nightmares. Her cousin is like, basically, I know what happened, but doesn't say it. And she's like, well, there's a secret between us where like we know it, but we don't acknowledge it. And then it again happens in her marriage, and her husband keeps asking, what happened? Could we talk about this, get through it, or whatever? And she's physically unable to acknowledge it. And I feel like that's another physical thing. Like when she finally breaks, it's like her body is just like gonna do this thing. She's not even really thinking about it. She's like, I'm just gonna do this. This is what I need to do.
Yeah, and I like how I love the theme of water throughout the book. Like both of the fathers die in water, the baby, and also the mother and our protagonists, they find solace in water. They crawl into the tub and they are, you know, wrapped up like they were in the womb, protected. The water is this protector, but it's also a source of death. And I love the end, how we find out the protagonist's name. We don't know her name until the end. And then we find out that her name is related to the river, and there's a whole story. And I just love the theme of water. It was just beautiful.
Yeah, I agree, because the water is such like a connective force, but also like I also thought it was interesting that the times when water functioned as like a connecting presence in this story were like often related to death. When like the father and Samson died, and like when her child dies, and then the times when water is comforting, it's often in solitude, like you were talking about with like the baths, and like it's the way that it's used is very interesting in that way.
It's sort of, it's like dark and negative for a lot of it, but when she's younger she enjoys swimming in the pond like with her father. Yeah, I like that, those scenes. So it starts out with like this positive vibe of like being in the water, but then like the monsoons and stuff, and you slowly become used to the idea that, oh, water equals death. And then there's like what, 4 to 6 people mentioned that die or almost die in water.
Yeah, the uncle goes back, and I feel like water is also like, it conceals things, because he walks out and he hasn't been there in a while, so he doesn't know, he's forgotten what the monsoon season is like, and he gets electrocuted, and the water hid that from him. So I feel like that is like another metaphor for all the silence in their culture. And then also like how when you leave a place and come back, you just don't have the same relationship with that place.
Mm-hmm.
We've been speaking a lot about the heaviness of the book, but I feel like there's the complementary theme of the redemption, the power of love and redemption. Just would love to hear people's thoughts on that.
I really enjoyed and appreciated the ending, because that's where I saw a lot more love come through, right? I mean, we see love kind of woven throughout. I think there's a lot of love between her and her cousin Darshi, and just how she got to be really joyful with her and be normal and just a teenager, but also towards the end where there's a lot of love and forgiveness, where her mother is still reaching out to her and asking to see her, or she gets visitors in prison. And I think that just seeing that little bit of love, and knowing that someone understands, and perhaps the best person to understand would be Darshi, right? Like just having known it all along, I think But it was powerful because I think that all along she was seeking a sense of belonging, and a sense of acceptance and home and safety. And these people who do love her, like truly love her and care for her, provided her with as much security as they possibly could. And I think that's powerful.
I also wonder too, like you mentioned Darshi, and I love the scenes when she's first. Actually, I love the scenes when she's in Sri Lanka and her cousin is sending her these box of these like Teen V magazines, and she's getting used to, like, she's got a poster of Duran Duran, and it's so taboo to have that, but that's her like connection to the States. And then when she comes here and they're talking about, like, she's so overwhelmed and shocked by everything, and I love the descriptions of like the aquanet in the hair and who these girls are. Those scenes those were the later, like, sweeter moments in the book where, yes, she's this person who is in a new country trying to deal with everything that's going on in her life and her own trauma, but also trying to like live in a new place. So Darshi is like her connection, that safety net of like getting her, like, they share the same room, getting her used to like going to school together. Let's get your clothing, you can't wear that to school. She teaches her how to like hide clothing under her her uniform or whatever she has to wear to the public school, or whatever her mom thinks she's going to wear. But then there's also the moment where when they're older and those two have a little tryst in the night, I was like, wait a minute, but then maybe that's like her solace. Like, she loved her because she like was that sense of love and warmth and comfort, because she helped her get used to this new place where she was literally the fish out of water. So that, I was like, wait a minute, what's going on?
Well, I think later, looking back on that moment with Darshi, she does say, I think she was my first love. And that you really see that in so many ways, like you're saying, Amanda, their relationship and the way that Darshi sort of helps her feel like a normal teenager. So, but she does reflect back on her being the first.
Mm-hmm. And then when she comes to visit at the end, I thought that was really poignant.
Mm-hmm.
It has that cyclical element to it.
I think
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think part of what made this book so effective was the moments of warmth and love that she shared about her mom and her dad and Samson as well. Like, it made it more heartbreaking, but it made it more effective because it wasn't all this, like, it allowed them to be nuanced as well, even though they did terrible things and kind of like did fail her in like really significant ways. The relationships were complicated and had positive aspects to them as well as negative. So I just wanted to, like, because her childhood was not terrible, like, the whole way through. There were real moments of light and joy that she talks about in that happening as well. So
I was just gonna say, I thought it was interesting just that she and Darcy can still like love each other at the end. And like, obviously it's a different relationship than between her and Daniel, of like, it wasn't Darcy's child. But it was also like how it relates to silence, of like, they did kind of have the open secret of, they basically had the understanding of like, I know what happened to you, we don't have to talk about it, but like there is that understanding, whereas she never ever like really opened up to her husband. And then at the end he wrote her the letter where it was like, I will always love you, but I will never forgive you. And it's kind of like acknowledging that like there's shared love, but it's like it is truly unforgivable. And obviously that is a different relationship since he's like the father and it was his child. But I also think that's interesting, relating to like how open she was with him and how she never was able to talk to him.
Yeah, I think loving like relationships throughout the book do a good job to establish that this character is lovable. And I think that that's important because we learn in the beginning right away that she's done this most heinous crime. And so, I think it's important for the readers to find her lovable, because otherwise you're reading this book where it would be difficult to read if you could never try to understand how she became the way she became or what happened. So I think that love is established, and it just shows you that shows a facet of the main character.
Yeah, and I never had a hard time deciding whether to like or not like her. She just was what she was, and I accepted that. And there were so many moments of just like thoughtfulness and tenderness and like lighthearted moments, and this love spread across all of this trauma and like terrible things that were happening through all sorts of avenues in her life. I never really thought about it. I just read her because I wanted to know her story.
We're all silent as we watch a cat across Audrey's lap. It's great.
She has a sixth sense about, oh, you're having a meeting or a Zoom recording. Let me just put my butt right in front of the camera.
Pets are welcome. I was texting Sheila about this, but I felt that a lot of this book read in real time. I think the choice of first person present tense was actually perhaps the most difficult thing for me. One, because it was so personal and it put you right in the center of the narrative, but again, also because sometimes the details felt excruciatingly like experiencing something in real time. And I was thinking about how a lot of my fiction doesn't quite do that, right? Because a lot of fiction uses past tense. You end up feeling like you're just witnessing it as opposed to living it. And so for me, that enhanced the impact of the book in a lot of ways, but also was just like a bit of a grind because so much of the content was difficult.
Yeah, I think the first question you asked was like, how are you processing it? And I'm like, I'm still processing it a week later.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
I read it in a few different bursts because I couldn't put it down. I wanted to know, not that I wanted to know, I just didn't want, I was afraid to leave that spot. I just wanted to continue and stay in that, because I was in that mind frame, and you really have to get to a place when you're reading it. And once you get there, it's like hard to, and I missed a couple of things because I was supposed to be doing something else, and I just could not finish where I was with her and the people in her life and what was going on. I couldn't leave it. And I finished it and I was just like, okay, wait a minute. I need to go and do, I like had to take a minute to like literally just like sit and realize, okay, you're in your living room. This is what's happening. You need to go into this now. It's okay. Put the book down. Like I just had to jump to another task. And it was just like, and I was like going to meet somebody, and like my friend is pregnant, and I was just like, oh my God, and she's a mother, and oh my God, the book. And like my brain was all over. But I like reading those books that stay with you and make you think and take you somewhere that you haven't been, and then you learn and grow. And like this is, like Lucy said, it's one of my favorite books I've read this past year, and I would not have picked up this book. And if someone said, hey, you should read this, I'd be like, eh. But for me, I like participating in this kind of a discussion group because I'm gravitated to picking up this thing that I would not have naturally grabbed. And I'm so glad that I did. Like this is I would have been really sad if I never got to read this book or talk about it with anybody.
Well, like to pick up on that nugget of your story, like going to go see your friend who's pregnant, I'm curious if there are parents on this call or if you are in close contact with children, and how did that feel reading this? Because I'm not a parent, I'm not in close contact with children. So it was a lot easier for me to divorce myself or like be able to read it as just a reader. And I would love to hear about the other experience.
Well, I was surprised to read that article where the author said she did not have children, because I felt that like the pregnancy scenes and the birth scenes were so descriptive and visceral in a way that seemed very connected and very real. And then that for me, I mean, the end I think is devastating for anyone, but it just, I just kept like having almost had to put it down and think no, she's not going to do that. She's not, just even starting with the like giving her child the sleeping pills, like that. Just, yeah, it just I had a strong, like almost physical reaction to it, but I can't believe that she herself did not go through pregnancy and childbirth.
Yeah, I have a child that's just slightly younger than the age of her child when she yeah, so it was incredibly difficult to read. Like I had to like that part started and I knew it was coming and I had to just like power through because I was like I can't like prolong this sort of and I think after I read it, I was reading it in the evening and I like went and like looked at my baby because I was like, you're still here, like it's okay. It was just like, and the detail with the sippy cup and her being in the car seat, it was really hard to read because that's what my daughter's doing right now. But yeah, the pregnancy and birth scenes also, I cannot believe that she hasn't had natural children. Like this was the book that made me then go like the detail about the hips unhinging like a snake. I then went and like looked in the mirror and was like, oh yep, my like part of my body, like my hips are a little bit lower now, and I hadn't noticed before I read this book. Till I was like, let's really so yeah, I cannot believe that she didn't have children because truly it was very like evocative of what childbirth and pregnancy was like and how, especially, yeah, just the particular things that both of those that make them very difficult. But yeah, the act at the end was very hard to read for me.
I think another part that really rung true is was how you sort of become public domain once you become a pregnant woman. I mean, already up until that point, she's talked a lot about what it means to be a woman and the shame and but that once you become pregnant, it's just you're not yourself anymore, and everybody gets to have opinions and comments, and there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And the book is very much framed in that. I mean, she talks in the beginning about, you know, no mother is a good mother because of all these things, but in the end she says, because I did what I did, I'm allowing other mothers to be a good mother because they didn't do what I did. And then I also think it's important because I think there's not a lot of books that have like postpartum psychosis in it, you know, which is essentially what I think what happened to her. You know, we've just started to talk about postpartum depression, but there are a lot of different ways that can manifest in different pieces. And so I think from start to finish, the motherhood piece of this book was just very well crafted.
Yeah, how difficult it is to adjust, or it can be to adjust to like this new role that you're in, I think was something she captured really well, where like there's so much joy, but also it is a very difficult thing that our society doesn't really support because they put so many labels and behaviors on you and like are specific about the way that you are in the world as a mother. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
And then she also she captures how oh, you're a woman, you must have children. Like society also puts that on like, oh, when you're married now, when are you going to have a baby? Or even like her mother, like in her culture, that's like, hey, you're getting married, you're having a baby, that is what you're supposed to do, you're a woman. And so she mentions that, and it crosses cultures, like that expectation of like, you're attached, where's my grandchild? Or even like other people, like just, you know, acquaintances, they're like, oh, when are you going to have that baby? It's always, it just exists, it's this constant.
Well, and that just, there's no right answer for women, because then they do get accidentally pregnant and the environmentalist friend is like, but what about the polar bears? How could you do this? This is so selfish. There's just like no winning.
I really enjoyed that conversation with all of those young people at the restaurant when they went out, and then somebody mentioned that with the polar bears, and her and Daniel were just like, we'll love this baby, it'll be okay, we don't have to have a baby. But even like when she's having the baby and there's her and Daniel, she is also toying with this, like, I belong to Daniel, Daniel belongs to me, but does he love this baby more than me? Is he choosing her over me? And she has a lot of anguish about thinking about that.
Sorry, struggling with Zoom. I was going to say, I think that fear also is like an unconscious fear that goes back to her abuse as a child. She doesn't recognize that's why. And then I think another like important aspect of her unraveling is when she has this child, Daniel's gone. He's just gone. And she's expected to do everything and have basically no social interaction with adults. Like she just is there with her child and that's it.
Mhm.
And it's really isolating on top of all of her unrealized trauma.
Mhm. Yeah, because she had put all of her eggs into her relationship. It was only her and only Daniel, and that's a whole other thing. They were very enveloped into their relationship, and she could only eat, sleep, and breathe Daniel. And then she's pregnant, and then she has this baby, and she's in her special baby world. But then that's when his career takes off, and he's not there. He got finally what he wanted, but then she's there with this baby, and that's a lot happening at one time for her to process, and that just adds to the pile of things she has to think about and deal with and manage, because she's not okay with him not being there. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a reality for like a lot of moms, having to constantly like be the primary caretaker of children and also not have the social support necessary. Whereas I think in heterosexual relationships, the fathers tend to have a lot more access to public and social support, and are also not going through the thing of, having their body owned by or association or otherwise by someone else. And so I thought that her describing the mania that results from it. I mean, I think there was that one, it was just like a few sentences that really stood out to me, where she remembers herself and her career as a nurse and says, I was a good nurse. I did a lot of good work. And it was almost just like this momentary connection to who she is as a person, and then she just loses that thread and goes back into the I don't want to use the word psychosis, but just that thought process of only being centering around the baby. Yeah, so she definitely captures what it's like for a lot of moms.
And then when she's in the park and there are other moms or women that are there, her baby is so fair and she is so dark. Then you get into race, and then they're like, no, she's like, no, this is my baby.
Sorry.
I was just going to say that there's another part in the book where it talks about how it says that when babies are younger, they look more like their fathers. They've already claimed their mark early on. And then and I'm thinking, oh man, when I was a baby, I looked like my dad, and now I look like my mom. Anyway, so that struck a chord with how like that the baby looked so much like the dad and was so fair. And then she made that comment about how they look like their fathers when they're tiny.
Yeah. Going back to Sheila's earlier question about if people have children or are around children, like what was relatable. I was thinking about silence and how it operated for her in terms of not being able to heal, not being able to do a lot of the work. And then there's also a lot of silence around teaching children about safety. And I think that transcends cultures, but it's especially true in South Asian cultures, where we just don't talk about it. We don't prepare children. We don't teach them how to protect themselves. And so I have nibblings. Nieces and nephews, and I have been working with them on body safety things. And so we've been learning slowly about boundaries and, like saying no, and if it's something makes you uncomfortable, who are safe adults to talk to, and all of those different things. And for me, that was actually quite a terrifying thing to approach, because one, I didn't want to overstep my bounds because I'm an aunt and not a parent. And also because I'm so aware of how taboo it is to teach children appropriate names for, their genitals or whatever else, or like teach them these ideas, because people are still so resistant to it. And I thought about how if she had a chance to heal, if she had access to resources, if she wasn't shrouded in silence, then Ganga would have probably been able to do that for her child and taught her child that she would have another option other than killing her child would have been available to her, and she would have been able to provide her child the kinds of tools needed to recognize when something wasn't right and actually protect themselves, or turn to her so she could protect them. Yeah.
When that made me think of one thing I did notice in the book was that she, I think, was actively teaching her child to be silent. Like there were parts where she talks about how her child already knows like not to cry and like to be quiet. And I think part of what was clear was like she thought that was what she had learned as a coping mechanism. And so she was like in these moments where she was being like arguably less than an ideal mother, what she thought she was doing was teaching way to like exist in the world that would keep her child safe.
And there was, I mean, her baby, I mean, she was less than 2, and Daniel made a comment like, shouldn't she be talking more at this point? Shouldn't be she be saying more? And the mother was like, no, it's fine, she'll learn. And so I wonder if part of that is that, just this sense of quietness. I also wonder, so she, after she had the baby, she still had a lot of things she was dealing with as far as her and Daniel and her being a mother and her body and the world and everything. But I also wonder how it would have been if she had had a son and then found out what actually happened to her as a child. Like if she would have just had a son, she would have felt, she may still have had that past trauma that would have made her think she wanted to still protect her child. But then finding out like would she still have wanted to kill the child if it would have been a boy? I wonder how, I just wonder, I thought that, because the book is so focused on motherhood and daughters and
I don't think that it would have, because the way that our society is kind of structured, we don't talk about male survivors of violence too much. And so we oftentimes associate like them with being protected in some way, even though that's not the case, even though there are lots of male survivors of sexual violence, especially childhood sexual violence. I just think that because we're not socialized to think that way and to see them as survivors, she probably wouldn't have been as triggered or activated as she was with her daughter.
So veering away a little bit from gender as a theme, I keep thinking a little bit about class and the way that class was actively weaponized as a form of protecting the family legacy. And even on top of that, like why class, how class impacted her life in Sri Lanka and forced her and her mom to leave, how being in the US as lower income, eventually the middle class, like impacted her life, and how these subtleties are not as explored, like written out and like essayed almost as much as gender was, but yet that had such a role to play in her safety or lack thereof.
Yeah, one thing along those lines that really struck me at the end was when the mom was talking to her, I think when The Secret came out, and she said like that, like, because I'm lower class, they will just see me as, you know, like, I can't remember exactly what it says, but I was like, they will have assumed my failure because I'm from a lower class and it will be my fault. Mm-hmm. And it was just a moment where you could see the ways that society had like formed her mom in such a way that like it allowed like the trauma to kind of like progress through her, because she also felt trapped in this marriage and, you know, the place that she had found herself.
Yeah, especially since she was so much younger than her husband, and then she was from a different class,
mm-hmm. A lower class.
She couldn't get rid of, she couldn't let that go. But
mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, it's interesting. She equated safety with being in a higher class, but then it was the total opposite of that. And she kind of recognizes it, but doesn't, again, like the daughter, like want to admit it to herself. Coming from a different place, obviously, because she's the first one experiencing this. But yeah, that kind of struck me as well.
Mm-hmm. And the anxiety of that, they're gonna say that she's crazy and they're gonna take her baby and raise it as a white baby, that it's fair skinned, and it's just gonna be like that the family is just gonna take it, and essentially it paralleled her mom of like they're gonna say that it's because she's foreign or lower class or however.
I also thought one other interesting moment was the way that you saw how like class was ingrained in her mentality, in the way that she blamed Samson for her abuse for so long, because that was a safer, or like felt probably like more fit the storylines that she had inherited more than the truth.
I mean, it is a lot of what you'll hear in South Asia and places where class disparities are under your roof. The people who hire help or who hire people from lower class, there'll be more of an emphasis on staying safe from them as opposed to the people in your own community who you interface with much more frequently, whether it's your own family or people in your community. And I know that the author is from a very elite, still like from a very elite circle in Colombo. I was telling Fatema this, like I had a Fulbright in Sri Lanka, and one of my peers worked with Nayomi on her first book, which requires like a certain level of like access and money connections. And so for her to like be hyper cognizant of the quiet ways in which class plays out was it was just like a very thoughtful way of approaching it that does not happen frequently in a lot of stories across the world. Like class is not, it's either like in your face or it's omitted completely. This was, I think, a nice touch.
Has anybody read her first book, the author's first book?
I put a hold on it after reading this book, especially in that part where she like references her own book. She's like, the main character's in a restaurant and someone is talking about this book because she says that she's from Sri Lanka, and they're like, oh, well, there's this book. And it was actually a reference to her first book. So I thought that was interesting.
Oh, wow. I didn't catch that, but that's really cool.
And like it was in a context of like talking a little bit of crap on it too.
Yeah, they're like an island of something, mirrors. I don't know what it was. Something about mirrors.
Island of 1,000 Mirrors. Yeah, it was pretty acclaimed for her debut.
Yeah.
I think I read that was her first time trying to write a novel, and then this was the second. So it's pretty impressive. Like the way that she writes is very captivating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I loved her writing style. I just have to know that I'm going in with some heavy boots on to get rooted.
I read this interview with, it was like this was a podcast about intersectionality, and the interviewer was saying that she read both of her books and she found the second one, I mean, she liked them both equally, but she found the second one more difficult to read as far as subject matter, and that was really striking, that there's one that is about war, and then there's one that is about motherhood and trauma for women. And it was the second one that is harder to digest than war. I thought that was a very interesting point.
I think that she mentioned, I also like that she mentioned that there is this larger social context happening with what's happening in Sri Lanka, but that's a story for another book and kind of sets it aside. I appreciated that because it doesn't ignore. I think a lot of diaspora writing can get into this idea of romanticizing both, like all of the things, right? Class or even water, right? And the role of water. But the fact that she's able to depict it in both positive and negative life and show that it is this bringer of joy, but at the same time, a bringer of death, you know, and show the nuances among the all of it. I thought that was really insightful.
Yeah, it wasn't like it didn't feel that she didn't feel the need to be explanatory.
Yeah.
Which I appreciated too. And her first book is about the Civil War. So it's not like she hasn't touched on it already.
I did want to share that Sheela and I will be talking to the author on Saturday, August 28th at 5 p.m. on our Instagram, Unerased BC. That's our handle. And if you're able to join us, please do. You'd be able to ask questions of the author and engage with her which is really exciting.
And we can link that also in our event description. Well, this might be a good wrapping up point then. So thank you everyone so much for joining us in this discussion. This was really a great book with a lot to discuss. And thank you, Sheela and Fatema, for leading us in the discussion of this book. It's always nice to have you here to do that.
Thank you guys for hosting us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.